We've done some research with colleagues at Stanford University where we've looked at using historical data, looking at previous recessions to try and think about who will be affected most in terms of wages by this recession that we're currently going through. And there's pretty clear patterns that are not only true for the UK, but actually true for most of the countries that have done similar studies. Historically, it's young workers who get hit most during a big downturn. Older workers tend to be better protected in their jobs, and so firms tend to protect their wages more than they protect the wages of younger workers. The effects are not massive between old and young workers, but it's kind of, at the size of the recession we're talking about, probably about a 10% drop in GDP, will cause about a 4 or 5% drop in younger workers' wages and perhaps 3% drop in older workers' wages. The second big and perhaps more important distinction is between those who work for small and large firms. So the evidence shows that when there's a big downturn in the economy, workers with large firms tend to be much better protected in terms of wages than workers in small firms. And these gaps are quite big. So a worker in a small firm might see a 6 to 7% wage drop, whereas a worker in a large firm might only see a 2-3% drop. And I think there's good reason to think why that might be the case. We tend to think that large firms are better at insuring workers. Essentially, they have more ability to withstand a downturn, and so they can protect workers on the downside, whereas small firms find that harder to do. And then the final group that kind of usually does worse when there's a downturn are men versus women. So generally, male wages tend to fall more than women's wages in a recession. That's partly because of the type of jobs and occupations that the two different genders work in. So men tend to be more focused on manufacturing and finance. Women tend to be more focused in the public sector, healthcare, and hospitality. That might be a bit different this time around because the recession this time around, it looks like it's hitting sectors that women work in somewhat more than men. So perhaps that effect might actually not be as strong as it has been in past recessions. So whether the same kind of workers are also affected by, not just by having low wages, but also by being made redundant, is I think a bit less clear this time in this recession. So it's certainly true that young workers are more likely to be laid off than older workers. That's almost always true in recessions, and it seems to be likely to be true in this recession as well. Particularly actually because the sectors that seem most affected, hospitality, retail, tend to employ a disproportionately large group of younger workers. So you'd expect them to be the ones that are currently perhaps furloughed, but at risk clearly of being made redundant sometime if this continues for much longer. And I think also the difference between working in a large and a small firm is also likely to play out in the same way, that actually it's the small firms that are more likely to find that they simply can't survive this downturn and go out of business, and subsequently those staff become redundant. Whereas the large firms, partly because of access to liquidity, there are more schemes available for large firms. They have easier access to financing, and so they should, in general, be able to see it through, and therefore those workers will be better protected as well. One area where kind of there will be some difference, I think, perhaps, is that, of course, the public sector will essentially be pretty immune to redundancies, so particularly sectors that are actually, in some sense, growing, the healthcare sector in particular. So workers in those sectors will be very well protected, clearly. And in any sector, really, where the government's a major player, it's clearly the government is committed to not making redundancies in those areas. The government have clearly taken the right steps during the crisis itself. I mean, providing replacement wages for people who are furloughed is a really helpful way of making sure that potentially they don't lose their jobs during this recession and can go back to work with the same firms when the recession is over. I think there are two risks. One is that this recession is actually not a straightforward V-shaped recession that perhaps in the early parts it looked like it might be. So there was certain optimism when Covid-19 became a pandemic that actually what we'd see is a very steep decline in GDP as the stay-at-home orders were enforced. But then as soon as they were lifted, there'd be an immediate bounce back in activity. If that had been the case, then I think we wouldn't worry too much about the groups that we've been focusing on, because the government's wage subsidy keeps them in employment and keeps them with income during that V-shape. And then as soon as we're back out, they can get their jobs back again. I think that's beginning to look less likely. I think the consensus is increasingly moving towards a more slow recovery. And the risk of that slow recovery is that some of these firms that are currently closed down will actually just cease to exist. So we're already beginning to see some of that in the retail sector, where firms have had to file for bankruptcy. I think the issue here is not so much that those firms wouldn't necessarily have gone bankrupt anyway. I think there's lots of evidence, for example, that in the hospitality and retail sector, lots of firms have struggled over the last few years to survive. But what's happening now is, because of this shock, is that they're all going down at the same time. And the risk is that we end up with a situation in which there's a glut of unemployment among particularly young workers, some of the less skilled, lower earning workers, who then can't easily find jobs when the recovery does begin, because those firms just don't exist anymore. So the government kind of, I think in terms of policy, the two areas I would focus on is making sure that the kind of protection that's currently in place extends long enough to try and make sure as fewer firms as possible go bankrupt, and then making sure that, to the extent that we can't save every business, that the workers in those businesses get the help they need, through it, whether it be through education, training, to get ready for the next job opportunities. No two recessions are alike, so we always have to rely on historical data to try and think about what might happen in this recession, and the only way we can do that is to look at previous recessions and use evidence from that. But I think this is a particularly unusual event. Recessions are very rarely events where entire sections of the economy simply close down. Recessions tend to be periods in which certain sectors get hit by lack of demand or supply shocks, but actually, a typical recession is a recession of 2-3% down in GDP. We're talking about 10% annual, but actually we're talking about, perhaps in this quarter, a 30 to 40% reduction in GDP. That's pretty much unheard of. I mean, even if you go back to the Great Depression of the 1930s, that wasn't a sudden drop in the same way that it is here. Again, it was a more gradual decline and then a very long time to recover. Here we're seeing a very, very steep decline. And therefore, I think it's difficult to make any easy comparisons with the past. And I think actually that's quite an important thing to think about, that while we can use the past to kind of give us some indication as to which groups are going to be affected, what sort of policies might work, and what sort of things we might want to focus on, I think we are in somewhat uncharted territory. And I think kind of it warns us that economists who sort of say, oh, it'll be like this, or this is the right policy to pursue, actually probably need to kind of reflect on the fact that we're in such a different world and such an unusual event, that actually we are all sort of guessing a bit, but it is basically informed guessing. And I think we just have to live with that and see it through. And actually sometimes perhaps go back to first principles and think about just the basic economics of how you think about these questions, rather than pretending that we can go back to a particular historical event and get the answer off the shelf.